Billionaire CEO trembles when she sees the single father on his Harley. "Get on. Now," he said. The morning fog rolled off the Pacific like a ghost retreating from daylight, and Celeste Davenport stood on the terrace of the Melbrook Hotel, watching it dissolve into the California sky. At 23, she owned this view, owned the hotel, the beach, the very horizon, it seemed, but ownership had become her loneliest achievement. She sipped her black coffee, bitter as the inheritance that had thrust her into this golden cage. 2 years since the accident. 2 years since her father's Harley had kissed that cliff edge and chosen the rocks below. 2 years of board meetings, quarterly reports, and a marriage that had crumbled under the weight of her grief and his ambition. The coffee tasted like ash this morning. Everything did lately. Celeste set the cup down on the marble balustrade and leaned forward, her royal blue blazer catching the early light. Below, the hotel's grounds sprawled in manicured perfection, palm trees swaying in the breeze, the infinity pool reflecting the sky, guests beginning their morning rituals of leisure and luxury. This was her kingdom, built by her father's vision and now sustained by her ruthless efficiency. But kingdoms, she'd learned, were cold companions. "Mrs. Davenport?" The voice came from behind her, tentative. She didn't correct the title anymore. Let them think she was still married. It was easier than explaining that Marcus had walked out 6 months ago, taking nothing but his pride, and a settlement that would make lesser men weep with joy. The divorce papers sat in her desk drawer, signed and sealed, a monument to her failure at something that wasn't business. She turned, arranging her face into the expression of polite attention that had become her default. A man stood in the service entrance, confusion evident on his weathered face. He wore the hotel's standard blue maintenance uniform, but something about him seemed wrong for the role. Too upright, too present. His dark hair was slightly too long for corporate standards, and his hands, wrapped in yellow work gloves, held a cleaning caddy with the awkward grip of someone unaccustomed to the tools. "Yes?" She kept her voice cool, professional, the wall between employer and employee firmly in place. "I'm looking for the housekeeping supervisor. They told me to report to the West Wing, but..." He gestured vaguely at the labyrinth of hallways behind him. "I think I took a wrong turn somewhere around the laundry facilities. You're new." It wasn't a question. "Started today. Ryan Walker." He didn't offer his hand, seeming to remember the gloves, the caddy, the gulf between them that was more than just organizational hierarchy. There was intelligence in his eyes, the kind that came from education and experience, not just street smarts. It made Celeste curious despite herself. She studied him for a moment longer than necessary, taking in details her business acumen had trained her to notice. The uniform was new but already worn with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin regardless of the costume. His posture suggested military background or maybe athletics, something that had taught him discipline and body awareness. And there was a wedding ring indent on his left hand, pale and recent. Recently removed then. Another soul navigating loss in a world that demanded you keep performing regardless of your wounds. "The West Wing housekeeping office is through that door. Left at the first junction, then right after you pass the staff break room," Celeste said, pointing. "You'll see the supervisor's name on the door, Maria Santos. She's been with us for 12 years. Tell her I sent you and that you needed navigation assistance. She'll appreciate the honesty." "Thank you, Mrs. Davenport." He paused, seeming to weigh whether to say something else, then decided against it and started to turn away. That's when Celeste's gaze drifted past him, and her heart stopped. In the employee parking lot, partially hidden behind a delivery truck, sat a Harley-Davidson, ocean blue, the exact shade of her father's bike. The same year, the same model, down to the custom chrome exhaust pipes that caught the morning sun like liquid silver. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the terrace tiles in an explosion of ceramic and dark liquid that seemed to happen in slow motion. "Are you all right?" Ryan had moved forward instinctively, then caught himself, remembering his place, the uniform, the invisible lines that separated them. But Celeste wasn't looking at him. She was moving past him, drawn by a gravitational pull she couldn't resist. Her expensive heels clicked rapidly across the terrace, down the service stairs, across the employee lot. She stood before the Harley like a pilgrim before a shrine, her breath coming short and fast, her vision tunneling until nothing existed except that perfect ocean blue paint. "That's..." Her voice cracked. "Her." She cleared her throat, forcing steel back into it even as her hands trembled. "That's your motorcycle?" Ryan had followed her, maintaining a respectful distance but close enough that she could feel his presence. "Yes, ma'am. Is there a problem?" "I can park it elsewhere if it's not appropriate for employee parking." I didn't see any restrictions in the handbook, but What year? I'm sorry? What year is it? She circled the bike slowly, her fingers aching to touch the chrome, the leather seat worn smooth by use and love. Every detail was perfect, exactly as she remembered. The slight dent in the left side panel, the aftermarket mirrors. Even the riding position spoke of thousands of miles logged with someone who understood the machine's soul. 2019. It was my father's before. He stopped abruptly, and Celeste heard the same grief in that incomplete sentence that she carried in her own chest every day. Before what? She needed to hear him say it, needed to know if he understood. Ryan's expression shifted, became guarded in the way people's faces changed when forced to speak of unspeakable things. Before he passed, 3 years ago last October, the silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken grief that recognized itself across the distance of strangers. The morning had warmed, burning off the last of the fog, and the Pacific stretched endless and blue behind them, indifferent to human suffering as it had been for millennia. My father had one exactly like this, Celeste heard herself say, appalled even as the words left her mouth. She never spoke of her father, never revealed anything personal to employees. But something about this man, this bike, this moment, had cracked her carefully constructed defenses. He taught me to ride when I was 16. Every Sunday morning we'd take the coastal highway north, racing the sunrise. He said that's when the world belonged to the riders, those few hours when normal people were still sleeping and dreaming their small dreams. She stopped, realizing she'd said too much. But when she looked at Ryan, she didn't see pity or the uncomfortable sympathy she'd learned to dread. She saw recognition. The 2019 is special, Ryan said quietly, running one gloved hand along the handlebar with reverence. Last year they made them with the real character, before everything went computerized and sanitary. Your father had good taste. Had. The word fell between them like a stone into still water. Past tense is a cruel verb. Yes, ma'am, it is. Ryan's voice carried the weight of someone who'd learned that truth the hard way. My father used to say that motorcycles were the closest thing to time machines we'd ever have. Not because they could take you back, but because they could make you forget just for a little while. About calendars and clocks and all the ways we measure our losses. Celeste felt something shift in her chest, a crack in the armor she'd so carefully maintained. Your father was a wise man. He was a mechanic who quoted philosophers while covered in engine grease. I thought he was embarrassing when I was a teenager. Now I'd give anything to hear one more lecture about Camus or Sartre delivered over a carburetor rebuild. Ryan paused, then added, I'm sorry about your father, Mrs. Davenport. Losing a parent, it rewrites your whole story, changes the ending before you've even figured out the middle. She looked at him then, really looked. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28, maybe 30. Lines around his eyes suggested someone who'd seen more of life than a hotel janitor's uniform would indicate. His hands, even in those ridiculous yellow gloves, moved with the precision of someone who understood tools and machinery. There was education in his bearing, intelligence in his eyes, and a grief so similar to her own that it felt like looking in a mirror. You're overqualified for this position, she said bluntly. It wasn't a question. A smile flickered across his face, there and gone like sunlight through clouds. Bills don't care about qualifications, Mrs. Davenport. They just care about being paid on time. And my daughter needs to eat, wear clothes that fit, and have health insurance. Dignity is a luxury I can't always afford. That's remarkably philosophical for a janitor. The smile returned, stronger now but with an edge to it. My daughter would tell you I'm philosophical about everything. It's one of my more annoying traits, apparently. Yesterday she told me I thought too loud, and it made it hard for her to concentrate on her Legos. Despite herself, despite everything, Celeste felt her mouth curve into something that might have been a smile. You have a daughter? Hannah. She's 7 going on 37. Asks more questions than a congressional investigation and has opinions about everything from quantum physics to why cartoon rabbits don't have to pay taxes. The warmth in his voice when he spoke of her could have melted steel. It was so pure, so uncomplicated, that Celeste felt something twist painfully in her chest. Where is she now? School, then after-school program until I finish here at 6. It's a carefully orchestrated dance of schedules and backup plans for the backup plans. Single parenting is like being a logistics coordinator for a very small, very demanding military operation. He paused, and his expression grew more serious. I'm sorry if this is too personal. You asked, and I don't get to talk about her much to adults. Most people's eyes glaze over after about 30 seconds of proud dad stories. How did you know about my father? Celeste asked, deliberately changing the subject but also genuinely curious. The hotel staff. They talk. Some of them have been here since before you were born, and they speak about your family, about your father specifically, with this mixture of respect and sadness that's hard to miss. Ryan shifted his weight and the movement made the leather of his jacket creak softly. They said you inherited the Mel Bruck chain 2 years ago after a tragic accident. They said you've transformed the business, expanded into 3 new cities, turned around properties that were failing. They're proud to work for you even if you never hear them say it directly. She wanted to ask why they wouldn't say it to her face, but she knew the answer. She'd built walls so high and so smooth that even kindness couldn't find purchase to scale them. It was easier that way. Safer. Less chance of being hurt again if you never let anyone close enough to wound you. Do you still ride? Ryan asked, and the question felt loaded with implications she wasn't ready to examine. No. The word came out harsh, final, a door slamming shut. Not since, no. Respectfully, Mrs. Davenport, that's a waste. He moved to the Harley, removed his work gloves with deliberate care and ran his hand along the handlebar with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. His fingers traced the chrome with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours logged in that exact position. A machine like this, it's not meant to sit idle in parking lots. It's meant to remind you what freedom feels like, what it means to move through the world with nothing between you and the experience except skill and courage and the willingness to lean into the turns. I don't need reminders. But even as she said it, she felt the lie in her bones, tasted it bitter on her tongue. Ryan looked at her with those 2 knowing eyes, and Celeste had the uncomfortable sensation of being seen, really seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Everyone needs reminders, Mrs. Davenport. Otherwise, we forget we're alive. We start going through the motions, checking boxes, accomplishing tasks that feel important, until we're lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering why none of it means anything anymore. The accuracy of that assessment should have made her angry. Instead, it made her feel exposed in a way that was almost intimate. You presume a great deal about my life. I presume nothing. I recognize symptoms because I have the same disease. He pulled his work gloves back on with methodical precision. We're survivors, you and I. We've learned how to function after loss, how to present an acceptable face to the world, how to be productive and responsible and all those other words that mean nothing when you're alone with your thoughts. But surviving isn't the same as living, and eventually the difference starts to matter. The moment hung between them, charged with possibility and danger and truth too raw to be comfortable. Then Ryan glanced at his watch, a simple, functional piece that had seen better years but still kept perfect time. I should report to my supervisor before they think I've disappeared on my first day. He picked up his cleaning caddy with the same careful attention he'd shown the motorcycle. It was unexpected, meeting you, Mrs. Davenport, in a good way. Yes, she couldn't manage more than that single syllable past the tightness in her throat. He started to walk away, then paused halfway to the service entrance. Without turning back, without looking at her, he said, "If you ever want to ride again, just to remember what it felt like with your father, the offer stands. No strings, no expectations, no complicated dynamics, just wind and road and memory. Sometimes that's enough to remind us why we bothered surviving in the first place." Then he was gone, disappearing into the service entrance, leaving Celeste alone with the Harley and a longing so sharp it felt like drowning. She stood there for a long moment, one hand on the motorcycle's seat, feeling the sun-warmed leather beneath her palm. This was dangerous. This man was dangerous. Man, not because he meant her harm, but because he saw through her defenses so easily, recognized her wounds because they matched his own. That kind of understanding could destroy the careful equilibrium she'd built, could make her want things she couldn't have, feel things she couldn't afford to feel. She should walk away, should forget this conversation ever happened, should make sure Ryan Walker stayed in maintenance and out of her life beyond the necessary hierarchical interactions. But as she finally turned back toward the hotel, toward her office and her meetings and her carefully controlled existence, she knew she wouldn't. Something had shifted this morning. Some internal compass had swung toward true north after years of drifting, and she was terrified to discover she didn't want to stop it. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and decisions that felt increasingly meaningless. Celeste sat in her top-floor office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the coast, and found herself unable to concentrate on quarterly projections or expansion proposals. The numbers swam before her eyes, meaningless sequences of digits that had somehow come to define her worth. "You've read that same paragraph 4 times, Margaret observed from the doorway. Her assistant had a talent for materializing silently when needed, a skill honed over 15 years of managing difficult people in high-pressure situations. "I'm being thorough. You're being distracted. What happened?" Margaret entered without invitation, settling into the chair across from Celeste's desk with the confidence of someone who'd earned the right to dispense with formality. She was in her 50s, impeccably dressed as always, with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Celeste considered deflecting, then realized how exhausting that would be. Margaret had known her since she was a child trailing her father through the hotel's corridors. If anyone had earned honesty, it was this woman who'd helped raise her in the margins between her father's business obligations. "There's a new employee. Maintenance. He has a motorcycle exactly like my father's." Margaret's expression softened in a way it rarely did, the professional veneer cracking just enough to reveal genuine concern beneath. She'd worked for Celeste's father for 15 years before transitioning to Celeste's service after his death. She understood the significance of that blue Harley, had been there the day they'd cleaned out James Davenport's office and found photos of him and his daughter on riding trips throughout California. "And?" Margaret prompted gently. "And nothing. It just rattled me, seeing it there in the parking lot exactly like I remembered. For a moment I thought—" She stopped, unable to articulate the irrational hope that had flared and died in the space of a heartbeat. "You thought your father had come back." Margaret said it as a statement, not a question. "Because grief does that. It makes us see ghosts in chrome and leather, makes us hope for impossibilities. I'm supposed to be past this. It's been 2 years. There's no statute of limitations on missing someone you loved, Celeste. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never actually lost anything that mattered." Margaret leaned forward, her voice taking on that gentle firmness she used when delivering uncomfortable truths. "What's his name?" "Ryan Walker. Do we know anything about him?" "I can find out. Though I should point out that doing background checks on employees because they own motorcycles might cross some ethical lines." Margaret paused, studying Celeste's face. "Unless there's another reason you're suddenly interested in the hiring decisions 3 management levels below you. He's overqualified. I'm curious about his story." "Curious." Margaret's tone suggested she wasn't convinced by this explanation. "When was the last time you were curious about anyone's story? When was the last time you looked at another human being and saw anything beyond their function in your organizational chart?" The question stung because it was accurate. Celeste had spent 2 years existing rather than living, managing rather than engaging. She'd become efficient, successful, and completely disconnected from the human elements that made any of it matter. Employees were resources. Colleagues were strategic assets. Even Marcus, before he left, had become more of a business partner than a husband. "He offered to take me riding," Celeste said quietly, surprising herself with the admission. Margaret's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. Bold. First day and he's already propositioning the boss? It wasn't like that. He understood. About my father, about what the bike meant, about why I haven't ridden since the accident. He offered, because he thought I needed to remember something I'd lost. Celeste looked out the window at the ocean, at the coastal highway where ghosts rode every Sunday morning in her memory. He said surviving isn't the same as living, and eventually the difference starts to matter. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, the kind of weighted silence that meant she was choosing her words carefully. Finally, she said, "Your father used to say something similar. He'd tell me that the hotel business was about creating spaces where people could remember what it felt like to be alive, to truly live, not just exist. He said too many people spent their lives in a kind of walking sleep, going through motions without ever waking up to the reality of their own experience. I remember." Celeste's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said it to me too, usually when I was stressed about exams or worried about college applications. He'd take me riding and remind me that none of it mattered as much as the feeling of wind in your face and the road beneath you. And do you need to remember?" Celeste looked at her assistant, this woman who'd been a second mother in all the ways that mattered. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore except how to keep moving forward, how to make decisions and manage crises and maintain the illusion of control. But Ryan Walker looked at me this morning, and it was like he could see right through all of that to the truth I've been hiding from myself, which is that I'm empty, that I've built this empire and this reputation and this perfectly controlled life, and none of it means anything because I'm not actually present for any of it. I'm just performing the role of Celeste Davenport, successful CEO, while the real me is still stuck on that cliff 2 years ago, watching my father's bike go over the edge. Margaret stood, walked around the desk, and did something she rarely did. She hugged Celeste. Not a professional gesture, not a comforting pat, but a real embrace that conveyed decades of accumulated affection and concern. "Forward is overrated," Margaret said into her hair. "Sometimes we need to circle back to figure out where we lost ourselves. Your father wouldn't want you to stop riding because of how he died. He'd want you to keep riding because of how he lived." After Margaret left, Celeste sat in the silence of her office and tried to remember the last time she'd done something solely because it called to her heart rather than her head. The memory didn't come easily. Every decision in the past 2 years had been calculated, strategic, designed to move her forward or protect her position or maintain her image. Nothing had been simply because she wanted it, because it brought her joy, because it made her feel alive. She picked up her phone, pulled up the employee directory, and found Ryan Walker's extension. Her finger hovered over the call button for a long moment. This was foolish. This was dangerous. This was crossing lines that existed for good reasons. She put the phone down and returned to her quarterly reports, but the numbers meant even less than before. She encountered Ryan again 3 days later, though not by accident this time. Celeste had been making her rounds, something she did weekly, inspecting the hotel with the meticulous attention that had made the Melbrook chain synonymous with excellence. She just finished reviewing the spa facilities when she heard voices from the service hallway. "Daddy, why do you have to wear that ugly uniform? Hannah, that's not polite." "But it's true. You look like a blueberry with legs. A very tall blueberry." The sound of Ryan's laugh, warm and unguarded and full of genuine amusement, made Celeste pause before rounding the corner. There was something infectious about that laugh, something that made you want to join in even if you didn't know the joke. When she did round the corner, she found Ryan sitting cross-legged on the floor in the service corridor, his daughter beside him. Hannah Bell was everything a 7-year-old should be. Blonde pigtails secured with yellow ribbons that matched her sundress, white shoes that were already scuffed despite the early hour, and an expression of profound curiosity mixed with complete confidence. She was eating what appeared to be a peanut butter sandwich, swinging her feet and studying her father with the seriousness of a philosopher contemplating existence. "Some of us," Ryan was saying with exaggerated patience, "need to look like blueberries to pay for things like yellow dresses and endless questions and peanut butter that costs more per ounce than gold." "My dress is yellow, not gold," Hannah corrected with the seriousness of someone correcting a fundamental error in logic. "And peanut butter doesn't cost more than gold, that would be silly." "You're absolutely right, I apologize for my mathematical imprecision." "What's mathematical impression?" "Imprecision. It means I was being sloppy with my numbers." "You should be more careful, Daddy. Numbers are important. Mrs. Chen says so in math class." "Mrs. Chen is a wise woman. I'll try to live up to her high standards." Celeste cleared her throat, and both Walker heads turned toward her with identical expressions of surprise. Wide eyes, slightly open mouths, and the momentary freeze of people caught in an unexpected encounter. "The boss lady chose blue because it's professional and doesn't show dirt as easily as yellow," Celeste said, moving closer. She kept her voice light, sensing that any hint of disapproval would turn this into an awkward situation. "Though I'll concede that yellow has its merits, particularly when paired with excellent ribbons." Hannah scrambled to her feet with the kind of unselfconscious grace that only children possess, studying Celeste with shameless intensity. She tilted her head to one side, reminding Celeste of a bird examining a particularly interesting bug. "Are you the boss lady?" "I am, and you must be Hannah. Your father mentioned you ask a lot of questions." "I ask important questions," Hannah corrected, emphasizing the word important with the gravity it deserved. "There's a big difference between questions and important questions. Regular questions are like, 'What's for dinner?' Important questions are like, 'Why do we have to sleep?' Or 'Where does music go when we stop listening to it?' Those are indeed important questions. Have you figured out the answers?" "Not yet. Daddy says some questions are more interesting than their answers, which seems like a cop-out to me, but I'm still working through the implications." Ryan had stood as well, and Celeste could see the apology forming in his expression, the embarrassment of having his personal life intrude on his professional one. She held up a hand to stop him before he could speak. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davenport," he started anyway. "The after-school program had a scheduling conflict, some kind of emergency staff meeting, and I couldn't find backup childcare on such short notice. My supervisor, Maria, said it would be all right if Hannah stayed in the break room and did her homework, but she wanted to see where I worked. I should have. It's fine, Celeste interrupted. Actually, I'd like to speak with Hannah, if that's all right with you. Ryan's surprise was evident, but so was something else. A careful hope mixed with wariness. Of course, if you're sure it's not too much trouble. Celeste knelt down so she was at eye level with Hannah, her expensive skirt pressing against the industrial carpet in a way that would have horrified her dry cleaner. Hannah, can I ask you something? Sure. I like answering questions almost as much as asking them. What do you think your dad does here? Hannah considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence. Her small face scrunched in concentration, and she nibbled on her lower lip before answering. He cleans things so they look nice for the people who stay here. He said his job is to make sure everything works the way it should, even the stuff nobody notices unless it breaks. He says invisible work is the most important kind, because it keeps the world running without anyone having to think about it. Your dad is very wise. I know. It's one of his better qualities, though he can be really annoying when he uses his wisdom voice to explain why I can't have ice cream for breakfast. Despite herself, despite the professional setting, despite every rule she'd made about maintaining appropriate boundaries, Celeste laughed. It felt strange, that laugh, rusty and unfamiliar, like using a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. Would you like to see what else your dad helps take care of? Celeste asked. The parts of the hotel that guests actually see? Hannah's eyes widened. Really? The fancy parts? The fancy parts? Can we see the chandelier? Daddy said there's a chandelier so big that birds sometimes fly into it by mistake, and they have to have a special person whose whole job is rescuing confused birds from crystal prisons. Celeste looked at Ryan, who had the grace to look sheepish. I may have embellished slightly to make hotel maintenance sound more exciting. The chandelier is indeed very large, Celeste confirmed, though we haven't had any bird incidents in recent memory. But yes, Hannah, we can see the chandelier, and several other things that might interest a young woman with important questions. So she gave them a tour no employee's child had ever received, and probably no employee's child ever would again. They saw the grand ballroom with its massive crystal chandelier. Hannah made her father hold her up so she could see it better, then spent 5 minutes asking detailed questions about how it was cleaned and whether the crystals ever fell off, and what would happen if you swung on it like a monkey bar. They visited the rooftop garden where weddings happened against the backdrop of the Pacific. Hannah wanted to know why people got married in fancy places instead of just in their living rooms, which led to a surprisingly philosophical discussion about ritual and meaning that had Ryan shooting Celeste looks that were equal parts amused and mortified. They toured the kitchen where the head chef, a bear of a man named Thomas who'd been with the hotel for 20 years, let Hannah taste test 3 different desserts while explaining the chemistry of baking in terms simple enough for a 7-year-old, but accurate enough to satisfy her need for real answers. Hannah asked why you couldn't just mix everything together at once, which led to an impromptu lesson about the importance of sequencing that had Thomas declaring her a natural culinary scientist. Throughout it all, Ryan remained quietly present, letting his daughter's joy unfold without trying to contain it or apologize for it. He thanked staff members they encountered with genuine warmth, remembered names after hearing them once, and moved through the hotel's spaces with an ease that suggested he'd already mentally mapped the entire property in his 3 days of employment. Celeste found herself watching him as much as she watched Hannah. There was something compelling about his attentiveness, the way he noticed small details and appreciated gestures of kindness. When a housekeeper held a door for them, Ryan thanked her specifically for her consideration. When they passed a maintenance worker repairing a light fixture, Ryan paused to ask about the problem and offer a suggestion that made the worker's face light up with recognition of expertise. This was not a man who'd always been a janitor, Celeste realized. This was someone who'd fallen on hard times and was doing what needed to be done with grace and dignity, rather than resentment. When they finally returned to the service corridor, Hannah was exhausted and happy, her pockets bulging with treasures Celeste's staff had discreetly slipped her, a mint from the restaurant host, a flower from the event coordinator, a small seashell from the concierge who collected them from the beach each morning. This was the best day ever, Hannah declared, throwing her arms around Celeste's waist in an unexpected hug. Thank you, Celeste. You have a really good hotel. It's fancy but not snooty, which is the best kind of fancy. You're welcome, Hannah. Celeste found herself returning the hug, her hands awkward on the small shoulders. When had she last hugged a child? When had she last felt the simple, uncomplicated affection that children offered so freely? After Hannah had been dispatched to the break room with a coloring book liberated from the children's club, Ryan lingered in the hallway with Celeste. The afternoon light slanted through a high window, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "But thank you. She'll remember this for the rest of her life. Not many 7-year-olds get personal tours from CEOs. She's remarkable. You should be very proud." "I am. Every single day, even when she's asking me impossible questions or arguing that bedtime is a social construct that unfairly privileges adults. She gets that from you, I assume." The philosophical bent. Guilty. Her mother used to say I thought too much and felt too little. Turned out she was right about the first part, wrong about the second. The pain in his voice was brief but unmistakable. Celeste made a decision, possibly a reckless one. "Have coffee with me. Tomorrow morning before your shift. There's a cafe 2 blocks south, the Blue Pelican. It's quiet, and they don't care if you sit for hours nursing a single cup." Ryan studied her face with that unsettling directness. "Is this a professional meeting, Mrs. Davenport?" "I don't know what it is, but I'd like to talk to you. Really talk, not just exchange pleasantries in service corridors. You see things in me that I thought I'd hidden successfully, and I'd like to understand how, and why." She paused, then added with complete honesty, "And maybe I'd like to tell you my story because I think you're one of the few people who might actually understand it." "Tomorrow morning," Ryan agreed after a moment. 6:30? "I start at 8 and Hannah needs to be at school by 7:45. 6:30. Celeste held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ryan shook it. His grip was firm, calloused, warm. The handshake lasted a fraction longer than professional, and when they released, Celeste could still feel the phantom pressure of his palm against hers. "Thank you," Ryan said. "For Hannah. For seeing past the uniform to the person underneath. Not everyone bothers." "I get the feeling you're very good at making people bother," Celeste replied, whether they intended to or not. After he left, Celeste stood in the empty corridor and felt something shift in her chest. Fear, yes, but also anticipation, also hope, also the terrifying sense that her carefully controlled world was about to become wonderfully, dangerously unpredictable. That night, alone in her mansion overlooking the same ocean she'd watched all day, Celeste couldn't sleep. She stood on her bedroom balcony in silk pajamas, a glass of wine forgotten in her hand, and thought about the last time she'd felt truly alive. It had been on the back of her father's Harley, racing up the coastal highway at dawn, the world reduced to wind and speed and the sensation of flying while still touching the earth. She'd been 18, invincible, certain that her life would unfold exactly as she dreamed it. She'd had plans, college, then graduate school, then maybe joining her father's business or maybe starting her own venture. She'd had a boyfriend she thought she might love, friends she trusted completely, a future that seemed limitless in its possibilities. Then her father had died on a bike just like that one, his death instantaneous according to the medical examiner, a small mercy in a situation devoid of them. And she'd married Marcus in a haze of grief and the desperate need for stability, someone to tell her she'd be all right even when both of them knew she wouldn't be. And she'd inherited an empire she'd never wanted, only to discover she had a gift for running it, a cold, calculating gift that came from the part of her that had learned to shut down emotion in favor of efficiency. And Marcus had left because he couldn't compete with a ghost and a corporation, because he'd wanted a wife and gotten a business partner instead, because the girl he'd married had disappeared into the woman she'd become, and somewhere in all of that, she'd forgotten how to be anything except competent. Ryan Walker had appeared in her life like a question she hadn't known to ask. He was everything she shouldn't want, an employee, struggling financially, a single father with complications she couldn't begin to comprehend. And yet when she'd watched him with Hannah, seen the love and patience and quiet strength, she'd felt something stir that she'd thought had died with her father. Not attraction, exactly. Or not only that, recognition. He understood loss. He understood the weight of responsibility. He understood how to keep moving forward even when you'd forgotten why. And he had that Harley, that perfect, impossible ocean blue Harley that connected them across the distance of their different griefs. Celeste raised her wine glass toward the dark ocean. "Well, Dad," she said to the night, to the ghost that lived in her memory, to the man who'd taught her to ride and to think and to question. "If you're out there somewhere, I hope you approve, because I think I'm about to do something either very brave or very stupid, possibly both." The ocean offered no answer, but then again it never did. It just kept rolling in, patient and eternal, waiting for humans to figure out their small dramas against the backdrop of its infinite indifference. Celeste went inside, set her alarm for 5:45 a.m., and lay awake for another hour before exhaustion finally pulled her under. Her last conscious thought was of ocean blue paint gleaming in early morning light, and the question that had been haunting her for 2 years. What came after survival? What happened when you were finally ready to live again? Tomorrow, she thought as consciousness faded. Tomorrow I'll start finding out. Start. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn darkness at 5:45 a.m., and for a long moment, Celeste considered canceling. It would be so easy. She could send Ryan a message, claim an emergency meeting, retreat back into the safety of her controlled existence where emotions were managed and risks were calculated. Instead, she got up. She dressed carefully, abandoning her usual business attire for jeans, dark, expensive, but still jeans, and a simple white linen shirt. She tied her blonde hair back in a ponytail, looked at herself in the mirror, and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because she looked different, but because she looked younger, lighter, like someone who remembered what anticipation felt like. Her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "I don't know what you're doing at 6:30 a.m., but I hope it's something reckless. You're overdue for reckless. Actually, you're about 2 years and 6 months overdue. Call me later with details or I'll assume you've been kidnapped and send security." Celeste smiled, pocketed the phone, and headed out into the early morning. The coastal highway was nearly empty, just a few early commuters and one dedicated surfer heading toward the break. The Blue Pelican sat on a quiet corner, its windows already glowing with warm light. Ryan was waiting at a corner table, 2 steaming cups already in front of him. He stood when she entered, and Celeste noticed he'd also abandoned his usual attire. Instead of the maintenance uniform, he wore jeans and a faded Harvard t-shirt that immediately explained several things about his overqualification. "You went to Harvard?" she asked as she sat. "Scholarship. Philosophy and mechanical engineering double major, which my advisor kept insisting was the most impractical combination possible. I told him I wanted to understand both how things worked and why they mattered. He said I was either brilliant or insufferable." Ryan pushed one of the cups toward her. "Black with 1 sugar, right?" "Right. Thank you." She wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for something to do with them. "What happened? Between Harvard and here, I mean. That's quite a trajectory." "Life happened. My father got sick my senior year. Pancreatic cancer. Aggressive and fast. I came home to help him through treatment, met Emma, Hannah's mother, and decided that maybe staying close to home made more sense than chasing academic glory. Got a job as a mechanical engineer at a manufacturing plant. Married Emma, had Hannah. For a while, everything was perfect. And then, car accident. Emma was driving home from her sister's place. Drunk driver ran a red light doing 70 in a 35 zone. They said she didn't suffer, but I'm not sure that matters when you're 27, and suddenly a single father to a 5-year-old who keeps asking when mommy's coming home. Celeste felt the words land in her chest like stones. "I'm so sorry." The aftermath was complicated. I couldn't work the same hours at the plant, couldn't maintain the performance level they needed. Eventually, they let me go with a generous severance and excellent recommendations that turned out to be worthless. Everyone wants the best engineer until he needs to leave at 5:30 to pick up his daughter. I burned through the severance faster than I'd planned, took a series of increasingly desperate jobs and ended up here, cleaning toilets with a Harvard degree and a broken heart. You don't sound bitter. I was. For about a year I was furious at the universe. But bitterness doesn't pay bills or raise daughters, so I had to choose. Stay angry or adapt. Hannah needed a father who could function, not one who was paralyzed by rage at the unfairness of everything. He sipped his coffee, his expression thoughtful. Now I'm just existing, moving forward because stopping isn't an option, making the best of circumstances I never wanted but can't change. Does that sound familiar? Painfully so. Celeste stared into her cup, watching the coffee's surface reflect the overhead lights. My father was my hero, not in a hyperbolic way. He was genuinely the best person I knew. Built the Melbrock chain from a single failing property into a small empire, but never lost sight of why hospitality mattered. He used to say we weren't in the hotel business. We were in the memory business. Every guest was trusting us with precious time they'd never get back. He sounds remarkable. He was. He was also reckless sometimes, too confident in his own invincibility. The day he died, he'd taken his Harley out for what he called a thinking ride, something he did when he had big decisions to make. Witnesses said he was going too fast on the coastal highway, hit loose gravel on a turn and went over the cliff. They found the bike in pieces on the rocks. They found him. She stopped, unable to finish. You don't have to, Ryan said gently. I was 21, still in business school, planning to join him after graduation. His death made me the heir to everything, and I had no idea what I was doing. Married Marcus partly because I thought I was in love, mostly because I needed someone to tell me I'd be okay. Threw myself into the business because it was the only thing that made sense when everything else was chaos. Built walls so high that eventually Marcus couldn't reach me anymore, and honestly, I didn't notice when he stopped trying. And now I'm 23, wealthy beyond my ability to comprehend, successful by every metric that's supposed to matter, and utterly, completely alone. I live in a mansion I didn't choose, run a company I inherited, and go through days that blur together into months that mean nothing. Until 3 days ago, when a janitor with a blue Harley asked me if I'd forgotten what it felt like to be alive. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the morning had brightened to that peculiar California gold that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. Early pedestrians passed the window, absorbed in their own dramas, unaware of the conversation happening inside the Blue Pelican. Do you want to remember? Ryan asked finally. Actually remember, not just intellectually acknowledge that you used to feel things? Yes, maybe, I don't know. Celeste met his eyes across the table. The offer you made about riding, does it still stand? Yes, but Celeste, you should know something first. He hesitated, and she saw him weighing words carefully. I'm attracted to you. I have been since that first morning when you circled my bike like it might bite you. And that's complicated for 100 reasons, not least of which is that you're my boss and I need this job. But I don't want you to think the offer is some kind of strategy. It's not. I just think you should ride again, regardless of what does or doesn't happen between us. His honesty was startling, almost aggressive in its directness. Celeste had spent 2 years in a world where everyone wanted something, where every interaction was calculated, where vulnerability was weakness to be exploited. And here was Ryan Walker, poor and powerless in all the ways that supposedly mattered, offering her truth without artifice. I'm attracted to you too, she heard herself say, which is terrifying and inappropriate and probably the worst possible professional decision I could make. But I'm tired of making smart decisions that leave me feeling dead inside. So yes, I want to ride. With you. Tomorrow morning, same time? Tomorrow morning. Ryan smiled and it transformed his entire face. Though I should warn you, once you start riding again, it's hard to stop. It becomes addictive, that feeling of freedom. Maybe that's exactly what I need. To be addicted to something that makes me feel alive instead of successful. They talked for another hour, their coffee growing cold as the cafe filled with the morning rush. They talked about books Ryan had read at Harvard and thought Celeste had never had time to articulate. They talked about Hannah's endless questions and the weight of single parenthood. They talked about the ocean and memory and the peculiar cruelty of past tense verbs. When Celeste finally looked at her watch, she was shocked to discover it was nearly 8. I have a meeting in 20 minutes, and I'm officially late for work, which is probably frowned upon for employees in their first week. But Ryan didn't sound particularly concerned. I'll talk to Maria, tell her you were with me. That will definitely start rumors. Let them. I'm tired of worrying about appearances. They stood together, and for a moment, Celeste thought he might kiss her. The impulse was there in the air between them, electric and dangerous. But Ryan just smiled again and said, tomorrow morning. 5 a.m., employee parking lot. Bring a jacket. It's cold on the coast before sunrise. I remember. She watched him leave, then sat back down and ordered another coffee she didn't need. Her phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from Margaret, but Celeste ignored them all. For the first time in 2 years, she had something to look forward to, and she wanted to sit with that feeling for a while longer. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would climb on the back of a Harley, wrap her arms around a man she barely knew, and remember what it felt like to be terrified and alive and completely wonderfully present. Tomorrow everything might change, or maybe it already had. The morning air was sharp and cold when Celeste arrived at the employee parking lot at 4:55 a.m. Ryan was already there, the Harley gleaming under the security lights like a promise made of chrome and memory. You came, he said, and she heard the relief in his voice. I almost didn't. 3 times I turned around in my driveway. She accepted the helmet he offered. But then I remembered what you said. Surviving isn't the same as living. Ready to live a little? Terrified. But yes. They rode north on the coastal highway as dawn painted the sky in impossible colors. Celeste held on to Ryan, feeling his warmth through the leather jacket, and slowly, mile by mile, she felt something unlock inside her chest, the wind in her face, the ocean stretching infinite beside them, the pure, uncomplicated sensation of movement and speed and being completely present in her own body. When Ryan finally pulled over at the same overlook where her father used to bring her, Celeste was crying behind her helmet, but this time, they were tears of release rather than grief. "Thank you," she said when they'd both dismounted. "Thank you for giving this back to me." Ryan studied her face in the growing light. "You gave it back to yourself. I just provided the transportation." Over the next 2 weeks, they rode together every morning. They also began talking, really talking, in ways Celeste had forgotten were possible. In the cafe before work, in stolen moments during his breaks, in late-night phone calls when Hannah was asleep and Celeste couldn't bear the silence of her mansion. She learned that Ryan read philosophy voraciously, that he'd once dreamed of teaching, that he played guitar for Hannah every night before bed. He learned that Celeste had wanted to be an architect, that she painted watercolors in secret, that she still slept on her father's leather jacket some nights when the grief felt too heavy. The hotel staff noticed, of course. Margaret raised her eyebrows but said nothing. Maria, Ryan's supervisor, smiled knowingly whenever she saw them together. But Celeste found she didn't care about the whispers or the speculation. For the first time in years, she was doing something that wasn't calculated or strategic. She was just following her heart. Then came the morning that changed everything. They were at the Overlook, sharing coffee from a thermos when Ryan said quietly, "There's something I need to tell you. About the accident. Your father's accident." Celeste felt ice flood her veins. "What about it?" "I was there. That day. I was driving south on the coastal highway with Emma, coming back from a weekend getaway. We saw your father's bike ahead of us." Ryan's hands tightened on the coffee cup. "And we saw what happened." "What do you mean?" "There was another vehicle. A black SUV. It came up fast behind your father. Too close, aggressive. Your father sped up, trying to get distance, but the SUV matched his speed. At the turn, the SUV swerved into his lane. Your father had to brake hard, lost control on the gravel, and..." His voice broke. "I pulled over. Called 911. Stayed until the police came. But the SUV was gone." Celeste couldn't breathe. "You're saying someone forced him off the road, that it wasn't an accident?" "I told the police everything. But they said without witnesses or evidence of the other vehicle, they couldn't prove anything. It went down as single-vehicle accident, excessive speed, driver error." Ryan finally met her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Celeste. I should have found you, told you what I saw, but I didn't know who you were then. And by the time I started working here and made the connection, I didn't know how to tell you." The world tilted. Everything Celeste had believed about her father's death, every story she'd told herself about his recklessness, every moment of anger at him for leaving her, all of it was built on a lie. "Who?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Who would want to hurt him?" "I don't know, but Emma..." Ryan paused, his expression tortured. "Emma thought she recognized the SUV. Said she'd seen it before, parked outside my father's shop. But she wasn't sure, and then she died and I couldn't ask her. And I couldn't." The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. Her father had been investigating something in the weeks before his death, staying late at the office, making mysterious phone calls. He'd mentioned a problem with one of their partners, said he was going to make things right. And Marcus, her ex-husband Marcus, who'd been so eager to marry her right after her father's death. Marcus, who'd tried to convince her to sell the hotel chain, who'd pushed for financial decisions that would have benefited outside investors. Marcus, who drove a black SUV. "It was murder," Celeste said flatly. "Someone murdered my father, and I think I know who." What followed was the hardest month of Celeste's life. With Ryan's testimony and a private investigator's help, they uncovered a conspiracy involving Marcus and several board members who'd been embezzling from the hotel chain. Her father had discovered it and threatened to go to the authorities. They'd killed him to silence him, and then Marcus had married Celeste to stay close, to control her, to ensure the evidence stayed buried. The arrests made national news. The trial would take months, but justice was finally coming. Through it all, Ryan was there. Not as a rescuer, Celeste fought her own battles, but as a partner, a friend, a man who understood grief and survival and the courage it took to keep choosing hope over bitterness. 3 months after that terrible morning at the Overlook, Celeste stood in her office and made a decision. She called Ryan and asked him to meet her on the beach, their beach where they'd built sandcastles with Hannah. "I'm promoting you," she said when he arrived. "Director of Operations. It's a real job, not a favor. You're overqualified for maintenance, and I need someone I trust to help rebuild this company's culture from the inside." Ryan stared at her. "Celeste, I can't accept special treatment because of what's between us. You're not. I'm offering this because you're brilliant and capable and exactly what this company needs. The fact that I'm also completely in love with you is separate. Related, but separate. You're in love with me? Terrifyingly so. But I needed to offer you the job first so you'd know it wasn't conditional on your feelings. Say no to the job if you want, but I hope you'll say yes to us." Ryan laughed, and it was the most beautiful sound Celeste had ever heard. "You're the most complicated, infuriating, wonderful woman I've ever met. Of course I'm in love with you. I have been since you circled my motorcycle like it might have answers to questions you'd forgotten how to ask." They kissed there on the beach, while the Pacific rolled eternal beside them. It wasn't simple. Nothing about their lives was simple, but it was real and it was theirs, and it was built on truth rather than convenience. 6 months later, Celeste stood before the hotel staff and announced major changes. The Melbrook chain would become a model for employee equity and advancement. They'd offer education benefits, flexible scheduling for parents, and pathways from entry-level to leadership positions. Her father's dream hadn't just been luxury hospitality. It had been creating places where people could build meaningful lives. She was finally honoring that dream. That evening, she rode her own Harley, ocean blue, purchased with her own money, up the coastal highway with Ryan beside her on his bike and Hannah in a sidecar Ryan had custom-built. They stopped at the overlook where everything had changed, and Celeste placed flowers at the spot where her father had died. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for teaching me to ride, for showing me what courage looks like, for loving me enough that your death couldn't stop you from leading me back to life." Ryan put his arm around her. Hannah held her hand, and Celeste understood finally that surviving wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The real work was learning to live again, to risk again, to love again, even when you knew how much losing hurt. They rode home as the sun set over the Pacific, 3 people who'd lost everything and found each other. The road ahead was uncertain, but they'd face it together, with wind in their faces, hope in their hearts, and the courage to keep choosing life over fear. Every single day, no matter how hard it got, because that's what living required. Showing up, even when surviving seemed safer, especially then. And as Celeste accelerated into the golden California evening, she felt her father riding beside her in spirit, proud, joyful, and finally at peace. The Harley's engine roared like freedom itself, and Celeste Davenport was finally, completely, magnificently alive.